This video goes over World War II. World War II started in 1939, but America did not enter it until Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941. World War II changed America. The Great Depression, a period of economic depression, ended. The war economy created new jobs, and many Americans moved to cities to pursue them. Anti-Japanese sentiment rose, and Japanese Americans were put in concentration camps, violating their civil rights. From 1942 to 1945, roughly 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of whom were U.S. citizens, were imprisoned in the camps. In 1940, a majority of Americans supported the war and wanted to join the fight against fascism. However, America itself was unprepared to join World War II. The Army and the Navy had been neglected during peacetime. Serving in the military wasn't a very popular or a well-paid job. On top of that, the military lacked equipment. Most airplanes couldn't fly in combat. Many men enlisted, but volunteers alone couldn't fill the ranks of the Army and the Navy, so many men were drafted. Of the 16 million American men who fought, 10 million were drafted. Of the men who served, most of them were young and white, with some as young as teenagers. African American, Native American, Asian American, Mexican American, and Puerto Rican men all fought in the war. But the Army and Navy were racially segregated, and people of color often faced harassment and discrimination. It was falsely believed that people of color were unfit for combat or leadership, so they generally weren't allowed to be officers or serve in combat. People of color typically performed non-combatant jobs, such as cooking or working as mechanics. However, there were some exceptions. The 761st Tank Battalion was an all-African American division and liberated 30 towns from Nazi control. The Tuskegee Airmen were an all-African American fighter pilot group, and they flew more than 1,500 missions over the course of the war. Gender roles changed a lot during World War II. Many men were fighting in the war, so women were allowed, even encouraged, to work jobs that had been previously restricted to men. Women were paid better than they were before, but they were still paid less than men, despite performing their jobs just as well. Most women were paid less than 50% of what men made for working the same job. Some women worked office jobs, others worked in factories, building military equipment like ships and airplanes. Many women worked for the government or the defense industry, and some enlisted in the military. The military had separate branches for women, such as the Women's Army Corps and the women accepted for voluntary emergency services. They worked non-combatant jobs and could be nurses, radio operators, work in air traffic control, or transport cargo. Women didn't need to rely on men for financial support, so they had greater freedom and more control over their lives. Lesbians, especially, appreciated this newfound freedom. The American woman became independent. She was smart and as strong as the ship she built. She could take care of America while the men were off fighting the war. The American man was strong and courageous. He was tough. He fought for his country and was full of patriotism. However, the male body and the American man also became vulnerable. During the war, it was common to see pictures of injured or dead soldiers, and many men returned from the war with physical or psychological damage. Soldier shows were a form of entertainment for the troops. They were important for morale. Soldier shows allowed soldiers a brief pause from the stress of war. It was too expensive for the government to hire performers for the shows, so they were performed by soldiers. However, there weren't any women to play the female roles, so male soldiers would dress up as women to perform. Almost every show had female impersonation routines. The men who cross-dressed on stage typically volunteered to do so. They would often jokingly flirt with their audience. Many homosexual men performed in soldier shows. They were able to create their own culture and meet others of their kind, but they still had to be careful to hide their homosexuality. If they were too bold when flirting with the audience or took female impersonation too seriously, they could be transferred or discharged. The military was pressured by soldiers and morale officers to put on soldier shows. However, the military didn't want it to look like they were endorsing effeminacy or homosexuality, both of which were associated with female impersonation. The military worked with the press to promote the idea that the men who performed in soldier shows were just doing their duty to raise the morale of their fellow soldiers. The Army Special Services wrote and distributed handbooks that were used to put on soldier shows. They instructed soldiers on dressmaking and choreography for performances. Later in the war, women from the women's branches were present during the soldier shows, but they didn't perform. Women's Army Corps leadership thought that the shows were too sexually provocative and didn't allow their women to perform, for fear of damaging their image. Instead, the women worked backstage. They helped male soldiers pass as women by assisting them with makeup and getting them into costume. There was not a lot of privacy in the military. The men who served in the Army and Navy were always in close proximity with one another. Almost all of their time was spent together. They fought together and ate together. There was little privacy while showering, and it was common for soldiers to see one another with no clothes on. There were also no women. This environment made many men feel anxious. Soldiers would hang up pictures of women on the walls and would often tell explicit sex jokes and raunchy stories to one another. These actions helped affirm their heterosexuality. Soldiers would also joke about homosexuality to relieve fears about their sex-segregated environment. The Army and Navy would sometimes pair men up in a buddy system. This was common on big ships or in dangerous battle conditions. It ensured that every man had someone looking out for him. Soldiers and sailors would often buddy up even if they weren't required to. Buddies might be old friends, or brothers, or boyfriends, or simply two men who liked one another's company. Buddies spent most of their time together, growing very close. One man recalled he told his buddy things he'd never told anyone before. For the first time in decades, it was acceptable for men to have close friendships with one another. But these men had to be careful. They couldn't be physically affectionate with one another without arousing suspicion. There was a thin line between having a close friendship and being perceived as homosexual. Women in the women's branches of the military were also in homosocial environments. The military was sex-segregated, so they were surrounded by other women. Women often formed close relationships with one another. Unlike men in the military, women could be physically affectionate with one another without arousing suspicion. It was culturally acceptable for women who were friends to hug, walk arm in arm, and dance together during social events. In World War I, many soldiers came home with shell shock, a condition that we would refer to as PTSD today. The military thought that they would be able to prevent soldiers from developing shell shock by psychologically screening men who enlisted. The screening focused on mental and emotional disorders. Homosexuals were believed to have psychopathic personality disorders, so they were disqualified from serving. This was a significant change. Before World War II, homosexual sex could warrant a dishonorable discharge and a punishment, but now simply being homosexual was enough to stop someone from serving. The idea that homosexuals had psychopathic personality disorders linked homosexual behavior with a threat to national security. The supposed link between homosexuals and psychopathic personality disorders ties into the idea of the sexual psychopath that we discussed in a previous video. In the beginning of World War II, and during other wars such as World War I, men who had sex with men could be court-martialed. They had the right to legal counsel, and if they were proven guilty, they would be dishonorably discharged and could be sentenced to labor. Soldiers in the Army could be sentenced to up to 5 years of hard labor. Soldiers in the Navy could be sentenced to up to 10 years, and officers could be sentenced to up to 12 years. Eventually, court-martialing soldiers became too expensive. It was a long process that wasted precious resources during the war. In 1942, instead of court-martialing homosexuals, they were discharged under Section 8 of the Army Regulation 615-360. Section 8 discharges allowed the military to discharge soldiers who were considered mentally unfit for service, such as chronic liars, addicts, soldiers who antagonized others, cross-dressers, and homosexuals. Homosexuals discharged under Section 8 did not get legal counsel and did not need to be proven homosexuals. They could simply seem homosexual. Section 8 discharges broadened the net and affected more men than court-martials. Before Section 8, when court-martials were used to discharge homosexuals, the number of soldiers discharged for homosexuality was in the hundreds. Under the Section 8 discharge system, that number rose to the thousands. Over 5,000 men in the Army and 4,000 in the Navy were discharged for homosexuality. World War II brought the first women's branches to the military, and therefore the first rules about female homosexuality to the military. Women who enlisted were also psychologically screened for homosexuality and could be discharged under Section 8. Section 8 discharges were not dishonorable discharges, but they weren't honorable ones either. This meant that members of the military discharged under Section 8 were generally not eligible for veterans' benefits. They would be stripped of their rank, and any medals or awards they had earned would be revoked. Section 8 discharges disproportionately affected homosexuals and African Americans. At the beginning of World War II, homosexual men were faced with a dilemma. Should they enlist? Some homosexuals tried to get medical exemptions that allowed them not to serve, but most homosexual men and women wanted to serve and defend their country. Betty Somers, a lesbian, said she wasn't sure if she could live with herself if she didn't enlist. Homosexuals left their families, partners, and civilian lives to serve their country. Homosexuals who did enlist had to lie about their sexuality or purposely provide vague answers to questions about it. While official policy required recruitment officers to ask enlistees about their sexuality, some recruitment officers did not. Recruitment officers who had enlistment quotas to meet would sometimes overlook requirements regarding height, weight, or sexuality. This was especially common in the women's branches of the military. Male enlistees with feminine features such as slim shoulders or effeminate personalities were often suspected of being homosexual. Enlistees who were suspected of being homosexual were sent to a psychologist to be evaluated. Most military psychologists were recruited right out of medical school. This meant they had little to no practical work experience. And in their official military training, diagnosing homosexuality was discussed for less than an hour. Given their lack of experience and the fact that there is no reliable way to tell if someone is homosexual without them willingly admitting it, many homosexuals passed the screening and were allowed to serve. World War II changed ideas about public displays of affection and being emotional in public. It became acceptable to cry in public over a death or a loved one leaving to fight in the war. It was common for heterosexual couples to cling to one another or passionately kiss before one of them left to fight in the war. But homosexuals did not have this privilege. When Tyler Carpenter was drafted, his boyfriend, Eddie Fuller, went with him to his induction center. All of the other couples kissed and hugged goodbye, but Carpenter and Fuller had to settle for a handshake. Carpenter said it fell far short of the kiss we both wanted and deserved. World War II threw many young men and women into homosocial situations. These young people were away from their families and away from societal expectations. This allowed them to experiment with and understand their sexuality in new ways. Many enlistees formed romantic and sexual relationships with one another. Some of these relationships were brief, some of them were long, some of them ended when the war ended, and some of them lasted beyond World War II. World War II also allowed formerly isolated homosexuals to meet one another. These men and women learned that they were not alone in the world and were able to form communities with others like them. Some homosexuals joined the military to escape societal expectations or to meet other homosexuals. Pat Bond joined the Women's Army Corps to find other lesbians, and she was successful. There were many homosexuals in the Women's Army Corps. Some lesbians in the women's branches of the military had short hair and wore masculine clothes. These women were often referred to as butch. On dates with other women, butches would play a masculine role. They would ask other women out and would pay the bill on dates. Butch women were a part of lesbian subculture and also existed outside of the military. Homosexuals in the military could go off base to socialize with other homosexuals or go to homosexual bars. This was risky. They could be turned in or arrested in police raids on homosexual establishments. If these things happened, homosexuals could be discharged or punished. Homosexuals were often friends with one another or would form cliques. Some homosexuals were harassed or mistreated in the military, and others were uneasily accepted. Some women in the women's branches would refuse to talk to or socialize with women they knew to be lesbians. Sarah Davis enjoyed serving in the military, but said, "I think my experience was not so positive. It threatened my love life and my very strong feelings towards another person. It was not all right to fall in love with a woman, so it made me very, very guarded for years and years. It took away what power I thought I had. It broke my spirit. Really, a lot. And that's been hard to recover. Very hard." Some male soldiers and sailors were fine with homosexual men, as long as they didn't pursue men who weren't interested and didn't act too gay. Some officers tolerated homosexuals as long as they were discreet, while other officers reported anyone they suspected to be homosexual immediately. In the minds of the American public, men in the military were as tough as nails. They were strong and had a taste for battle. Meanwhile, they thought homosexuals were timid and weak, the complete opposite of a soldier. In reality, these stereotypes were untrue. Most soldiers and sailors didn't have a taste for battle and were just trying to survive the war. Most of them were reluctant to kill. Homosexuals weren't inherently timid or weak. Many homosexuals were trusted and brave soldiers and sailors who fought just as well as their heterosexual counterparts. Only 9,000 homosexuals were officially identified in the Army and Navy, but many more served. Historical estimates of homosexuals in the military range from 650,000 to 1.6 million. Many homosexuals died, and many watched their partners die. Jim Warren watched his boyfriend die. He said, "They brought him back, and he was at the point of death. He was bleeding. He had been hit about 3 or 4 times. I stood there, and he looked up at me, and I looked down at him, and he said, 'Well, Jim, we didn't make it, did we?' And tears were just rolling down my cheeks. And he kind of gave me a boyish, crooked grin and said, 'Well, maybe next time.' And I said, 'I'm going to miss you.'" Warren held his boyfriend's hand while he died. Other soldiers saw the whole thing, but they allowed him to express his grief. No one said anything or reported him. However, most homosexuals who openly grieved for their dead partners would be punished or discharged. Many men had to hide their grief when their partners were killed. Burt Miller's lover was killed. When Miller heard he died, he couldn't talk to anybody for the rest of the day. "I couldn't cry and I couldn't tell anybody, just alone. No way I could release any of that emotion or express any of it. It was the most terrible day I've spent. Some men threw themselves into work to avoid their grief. Some relied on faith. Others used the memory of their partners to motivate them to continue on. We do not know, and will never know, how many homosexual soldiers and sailors died serving their country in World War II. I'd like to share a quote from Coming Out Under Fire, The History of Gay Men and Women in World War II, one of my sources for this video. It is one of the many tragic ironies of the war that gay soldiers and officers had to kill, risk their lives, and see their buddies die in order to gain some respect and a sense of belonging as men among men. Homosexuals were often purged from the military. Purges consisted of suspected or known homosexuals being interrogated and pressured into giving up the identities of other homosexuals. They often resulted in tens or hundreds of men and women being discharged. They could start because of a rumor that someone was homosexual, if someone was caught being homosexual, or if someone was caught in a homosexual establishment. Effeminate men and masculine women were often targeted first in purges. Purges were humiliating and degrading. Homosexual soldiers were interrogated by officers and asked invasive and extensive questions about their sex life and sexual partners. Soldiers were forced to testify under oath, had no legal counsel, and could not discuss the proceeding with anyone. They were often given false promises of immunity to try to get them to name their lovers and homosexual friends. Officers would often try to pressure soldiers into naming names by threatening to tell their families they were homosexual. One young girl, Helen, was pressured this way. They threatened to tell her parents she was homosexual. Helen jumped out of a window on the 6th floor, committing suicide. She was 20. Suspected homosexuals, or homosexuals that were going to be discharged, were segregated from the other soldiers and imprisoned in barracks, psych wards, cells, or in buildings surrounded by barbed wire fences. Soldiers and sailors could be locked up for months before being discharged and sent back to the U.S. on ships. The facilities and ships homosexuals were imprisoned on were often referred to as queer stockades. The word queer meant weird, but it was also a derogatory term for homosexuals. When talking about his experience in a queer stockade, Bill Thompson said, "It wasn't a concentration camp, but psychologically it was. We weren't going into ovens, but the rest of it was all there." That comparison wasn't made lightly. Homosexuals were almost always psychologically abused by the guards or other soldiers. They were taunted and humiliated. Some homosexuals were physically or sexually abused. Some were labeled with tags that read psychopathia sexualis, sexual psychopath. Fred Thayer was labeled with one of those tags. He was placed on a truck and transported to a ship that would take him and other homosexuals back to the U.S. During that truck ride, Thayer was reunited with a friend he hadn't seen in weeks. Thayer said his friend looked like something from Dachau, a Nazi concentration camp. "I'll never forget it. He took one look at me and fell into my arms and cried for the next hour and a half." Thayer himself weighed only 112 pounds, and when describing himself said, "I looked like a skeleton, like I'd been through hell." In a way, I suppose I had, but it wasn't from the Japanese and the guns. The men being treated this way had fought for their country. Many of them had been drafted. Some of them had risked their lives in combat, and the way they were treated was incredibly cruel. It violated their dignity. Homosexuals in queer stockades relied on one another for survival. Many of them were depressed and suicidal. They kept up their spirits by singing and doing dance numbers. They made jokes about being homosexual and gave one another drag nicknames. World War II ended in 1945. The war was traumatizing for every American, regardless of if they had served in the military. Everyone knew someone who had died. After World War II, it was socially acceptable to cry or be emotional in public. In 1948, segregation in the United States military officially ended, but segregation in general was still legal. African American veterans were often turned away from bars and other establishments, but were welcomed in black neighborhoods such as Harlem. Marriage rates rose, and many young newlyweds moved from the cities to the suburbs. Many Americans wanted to return to traditional gender roles. Women were expected to give up their jobs. Some women did leave the workforce, but many stayed. Many lesbians kept their jobs so that they could stay financially independent from men. Men and women discharged from the military due to their sexuality faced many challenges. Their discharge papers stated that they were discharged for homosexuality. Employers, veterans organizations, and insurance companies could all request to see their discharge papers. This made it difficult for them to get jobs or veterans benefits, such as healthcare, reduced loans, disability pension, access to job search programs, and unemployment pay. These papers were often treated with limited confidentiality, which could lead to their communities and families discovering their sexuality. Some homosexuals were accepted by their communities and families, but most were not. In 1945, the Pittsburgh Courier wrote extensively about the treatment of soldiers discharged under Section 8. You will recall that Section 8 discharged soldiers that were considered mentally unfit for service, such as chronic liars, addicts, soldiers who antagonized others, cross-dressers, and homosexuals. African Americans and homosexuals were disproportionately affected by Section 8. The Pittsburgh Courier criticized the Army, the government, and the Veterans Association for the mistreatment of Section 8 dischargees. Many homosexuals wrote letters to appeal their discharges. From 1945 to 1947, homosexuals could be granted honorable discharges, provided they didn't have sexual relations with other men. In that time period, homosexuals could also have their less than honorable discharges upgraded. In 1946, largely due to the Pittsburgh Courier, a House committee issued a report on Section 8 discharges. The report highlighted the injustices Section 8 dischargees faced and advocated to abolish the Section 8 discharge. In 1947, the military stopped using the Section 8 discharges. They instead gave soldiers a general discharge for unsuitability, and those soldiers were eligible for military benefits. However, the military made it almost impossible for homosexuals to get these discharges. Homosexuals were instead discharged without honor and were ineligible for veterans' benefits. After the war, some homosexuals went home. Some married members of the opposite sex. Some of those homosexuals had lovers outside of their marriages. Some homosexuals found happiness, but others had trouble fitting in. Homosexuals who felt like they didn't belong in their hometowns often moved to cities. Those who served in the military in World War II were brought back to America on ships. These ships landed in port cities along the east and west coast of the United States. Many homosexuals chose to stay in these cities rather than to go home. As a result, homosexual communities in port cities experienced a massive population increase. In cities, they could meet other homosexuals and find communities. Homosexual neighborhoods were often less policed, which allowed homosexuals some freedom from gender and sexual normalities. However, the police knew where homosexual neighborhoods were, which could make them targets of police raids. These neighborhoods were often low-income neighborhoods and were usually neglected by city officials. Homosexuals who were open about their sexuality struggled to find work, so many opened up their own businesses. Homosexual bars were important to the community. They were a place to share news, make friends, and find potential partners. To review, many Americans supported joining World War II, but America was unprepared for war. Many young men were drafted to serve. At the time, the Army and Navy were racially segregated, and most people of color weren't allowed to serve in combat. Women were encouraged to work and were allowed to work more jobs than they were able to previously. The military formed separate branches for women to join. The American woman became independent. The American man was patriotic and courageous, but also vulnerable to the horrors of war. Male soldiers would often cross-dress to perform in soldier shows, which were a form of entertainment for the troops. Men in the military had little privacy and were often in close proximity with other men. This made them feel anxious, so they made sex jokes and told raunchy stories to affirm their heterosexuality. Soldiers and sailors would also joke about homosexuality to relieve their fears. For the first time in a long time, it was acceptable for men to have close male friendships. Women in the military were also in sex-segregated environments and often formed close relationships with one another. Men and women who joined the military were psychologically screened for homosexuality. At the beginning of the war, male homosexuals could be court-martialed if they were discovered. They could be dishonorably discharged and sentenced to hard labor. In 1942, the military began to issue Section 8 discharges for men considered mentally unfit for service. This category included homosexuals. These discharges affected more men than court-martials. Section 8 discharges gave soldiers fewer rights. They did not have the right to legal counsel and did not need to be proven guilty to be discharged. Many homosexuals chose to enlist in the military to serve their country. To join the military, they had to lie about or provide vague answers to questions about their sexuality. Some recruitment officers would overlook homosexuality to meet the recruitment quotas. Military psychologists were in charge of evaluating soldiers for homosexuality, but most of them were severely undertrained. Public displays of affection were socially acceptable for heterosexual couples, but homosexuals could not openly express affection. The homosexual environment of the military allowed many young men and women to experiment with and understand their sexuality in new ways. World War II also allowed formerly isolated homosexuals to meet one another. Many women in the women's branches of the military were lesbians. Butch lesbians dressed in a masculine manner and played the masculine role in a relationship. Homosexuals could socialize with one another off base, but that could be dangerous. Some homosexuals were harassed or mistreated in the military, while others were uneasily accepted. Many people thought that homosexuals wouldn't make good soldiers, but homosexuals fought just as well as their heterosexual counterparts. Many homosexuals died, and many watched their partners die. Homosexual soldiers often had to hide their grief when their lovers were killed, lest they be discovered. Homosexuals were often purged from the military in a humiliating and invasive process. Suspected homosexuals or homosexuals awaiting discharge were imprisoned and segregated from other soldiers in queer stockades. Conditions in queer stockades were terrible, and homosexuals were often victims of psychological, physical, and sexual abuse. The homosexual soldiers that were being treated this way had fought for their country. In queer stockades, homosexuals relied on one another for survival. After the war, women were expected to give up their jobs, but many continued working. Men and women discharged from the military due to homosexuality were often denied military benefits. Their discharge papers made it difficult to get jobs, and the limited confidentiality these papers were treated with could cause their families and communities to discover their sexuality. From 1945 to 1947, homosexuals could be granted honorable discharges or have less than honorable discharges upgraded. In 1947, the military stopped using the Section 8 discharge system and instead issued discharges for general unsuitability. It was almost impossible for homosexuals to get these discharges. They were instead discharged without honor and could not get veterans' benefits. Some homosexuals married members of the opposite sex, and some of those homosexuals had lovers outside of their marriages. After the war, some homosexuals stayed in port cities, while others went home. In cities, homosexuals were able to find one another and form communities. Note: one of my sources, Coming Out Under Fire, The History of Gay Men and Women in World War II by Alan Barabay, interviewed many homosexuals who served in World War II. Some of those men and women requested to have a pseudonym printed in the book rather than their names to protect their identities. I reference both Jim Warren and Betty Somers in my video. However, both of those names are pseudonyms.